The Mediterranean Sea. Sunrise. For 2,700 years, ships have crossed this water. Greek triremes, Roman galleys, Arab dhows, Ottoman caiques, steel freighters. All of them, at one time or another, have made their way toward the same low stretch of Egyptian coast, where the westernmost branch of the Nile spills into the sea and the desert meets the water. On that coast stands a city. It has many names. Alexandria, the pearl of the Mediterranean, the bride of the sea, but we know it by its oldest name, Alexandria. And in Alexandria, for nearly 2,000 years, there has stood a library. Not the same building, not the same collection, not even the same location, but a library, a place where knowledge is gathered, preserved, and passed from one hand to the next. The first one, the one everyone talks about, is gone now. We do not know exactly what it looked like. No contemporary drawings survive. No detailed descriptions. We have fragments, references and letters, passing mentions and histories written centuries later. A few foundation stones, excavated from beneath modern apartment buildings. But we know what it contained. Or rather, we know what it was supposed to contain. Everything. Every play ever performed in Athens. Every philosophical treatise written in Ionia. Every astronomical observation recorded in Babylon. Every medical text compiled in Memphis. Every map drawn by every explorer who ever sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Every poem. Every prayer. Every dream. The Ptolemies, the Greek kings who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great, wanted to possess the entirety of human knowledge. Not because they were scholars, though some of them were. Not because they were idealists, though some of them may have been. They wanted it for the same reason they wanted gold and grain and war elephants. Because possession is power. So they sent agents to every port in the Mediterranean with instructions. Bring back books. Buy them. Borrow them. Steal them. Every ship that docked in Alexandria was searched. Any scroll found aboard was confiscated, taken to the library, copied by scribes. The original was kept. The copy was returned to the owner. This was not theft. This was acquisition. And it worked. By the 1st century BCE, the Library of Alexandria held, by some estimates, 500,000 scrolls. 500,000 individual works. No one had ever assembled such a collection. No one has assembled one since. This was the mind of the world. And then, it was gone. Who burned it? The question has echoed for 2,000 years. It is asked in classrooms and documentaries and YouTube videos. It is debated by historians and archaeologists and conspiracy theorists. It has become a symbol, not just of destruction, but of loss, of everything we might have known but will never know. But the question itself is misleading, because the library did not burn once. It burned again, and again, and again. Part 1. The City of Knowledge, 1:30 to 4 o'clock. To understand the destruction, you must first understand what was destroyed. Alexandria was not an ancient city. Not really. When Alexander the Great paused on the Egyptian coast in 331 BCE, there was nothing there but a small fishing village called Rhodotus. He saw the natural harbor, the protected coastline, the strategic position between Europe, Africa, and Asia. He ordered a city built. He never saw it completed. He died in Babylon 8 years later, at 32 years old, his empire already fragmenting. His body was hijacked en route to Macedonia and brought instead to Alexandria, where it remained for nearly 1,000 years, a tourist attraction in a golden sarcophagus. The city passed to his general, Ptolemy, and the Ptolemaic dynasty began. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks. They spoke Greek at court, wore Greek clothes, worshipped Greek gods. But they ruled Egypt, and they were smart enough not to alienate their subjects. They presented themselves as pharaohs. They built temples to Egyptian deities. They married their siblings, like pharaohs did. They mummified their dead. And they built the library. It was not one building, but many. The main collection was in the Bruchaean district, adjacent to the royal palace. An annex was later established at the Serapeum, the temple of the god Serapis, on the other side of the city. There were lecture halls and laboratories and dining facilities and covered walkways where philosophers could pace and dictate. The scholars who worked there were not volunteers. They were employees of the state. They received salaries, free food, tax exemptions, and lodging. In exchange, they were expected to study, to teach, and to add to the collection. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. He was off by less than 1%. Euclid systematized geometry. His textbooks were still in use 2,000 years later. Herophilus identified the brain as the seat of intelligence, dissected human cadavers, and discovered the difference between sensory and motor nerves. Aristarchus proposed that the earth revolves around the sun. It took 18 centuries for anyone to take him seriously. These men walked the same corridors. They ate in the same dining hall. They argued in the same courtyards. They shared ideas across disciplines in ways that would not happen again until the Renaissance. And they had access to everything. If you wanted to read the plays of Aeschylus, you did not need to find a copy in Athens. You went to the library. If you wanted to compare different versions of Homer's Iliad, you did not need to travel to different cities. The library had them all, side by side, line by line. This was the first time in human history that knowledge was centralized on this scale. Not just collected, but organized, cataloged, cross-referenced, made searchable. Callimachus, a poet and scholar, compiled the Penox, 120 volumes of bibliography that listed every major work in the library, along with biographical information about the author and an assessment of authenticity. It was, in effect, the first library card catalog. It was also, like almost everything else, lost. But we know it existed. We know what it attempted. We know the scale of the ambition. Everything. Everywhere. All at once. Part 2. The Roman arrives, 4 o'clock to 6:30. By 48 BCE, the library had existed for nearly 3 centuries. It had survived dynastic squabbles, economic recessions, and the gradual decline of Ptolemaic power. It had survived because the Ptolemies, however incompetent some of them were, understood that the library was not just a collection of scrolls. It was a symbol, the mind of the world, housed in their city. Then Julius Caesar arrived. He came not as a conqueror, but as a mediator. The current Ptolemy, the 13th of that name, was a child. His sister and co-ruler, Cleopatra, had been driven into exile. Both sides had appealed to Rome. Caesar, fresh from his victory over Pompey, pursued his rival to Egypt and found himself in the middle of a civil war. He took Cleopatra's side. He took the royal palace. He took control of the harbor. And he was trapped. The Egyptian fleet, loyal to Ptolemy XIII, blockaded the port. Caesar's forces were outnumbered. His supply lines were cut. His ships were vulnerable. He made a tactical decision. He ordered the Egyptian fleet destroyed. Roman soldiers prepared torches, resin-soaked cloth wrapped around wooden handles, lit from braziers on the docks. They boarded small boats and approached the Egyptian warships at anchor. The first torch arced through the night sky. It landed on an Egyptian deck. Oiled wood ignited. Tar caught fire. The ship burned. Then another. Then another. The fire spread. Warships were moored close together, stem to stern, to maximize harbor capacity. The flames jumped from vessel to vessel. Within hours, much of the Egyptian fleet was destroyed. But the wind was blowing toward the city. Embers rose on thermal currents, carried west. Some fell into the harbor, hissing and dying. Some fell on dockside warehouses. Some fell on the linen awnings that shaded the entrance to the docks. And some fell on the library. The exact sequence is lost. We know that the fire spread from the docks to the adjacent buildings. We know that the Bercaean district, where the main library was located, suffered extensive damage. We know that scrolls burned. What we do not know, and will never know, is how many. Ancient sources contradict each other. Plutarch, writing a century later, says that Caesar burned the fleet and the fire spread to the library. He does not say it was deliberate. He does not assign blame. Dio Cassius, writing 2 centuries after that, says Caesar set the library on fire himself. Deliberately. Maliciously. Seneca mentions that 40,000 scrolls were lost. A large number. But the library held hundreds of thousands. Was this the entire collection? A branch library? A warehouse of scrolls awaiting cataloging? Paulus Orosius, a Christian historian writing in the 5th century, claims the library was still largely intact and that the real destruction came later. He had no reason to minimize Caesar's culpability. He was not defending a pagan Roman general. He was simply reporting what his sources told him. We are left with fragments, contradictions, gaps. What we know, fire happened. Scrolls burned. Loss occurred. What we do not know, how much, how many, how permanent. Caesar himself never mentions it. His commentaries on the Alexandrian War describe the harbor battle in detail, discuss his strategic decisions, list his victories. They say nothing about a burning library. Either he did not consider it important, or he considered it too important to admit. Who burned the Library of Alexandria? Julius Caesar is the most famous suspect. His name appears in every textbook, every documentary, every YouTube video. But he is not the only candidate. He may not even be the most destructive. The question itself assumes something that may not be true, that there was one fire, one culprit, one moment of destruction. The library was not a single institution. It was a collection of institutions accumulated over centuries, housed in multiple buildings across multiple districts. It was not destroyed in a single catastrophic event. It was eroded, diminished, dismantled, neglected. The fire of 48 BCE was serious. It damaged the main library and destroyed an unknown number of scrolls. But it did not destroy the library entirely. The collection survived. The institution survived. Scholars continued to work, to teach, to write. The real destruction came later, in stages, over centuries. Each stage had its own perpetrator, its own justification, its own historical context. Each stage erased something that could never be recovered. So the question is not, who burned it? The question is, who burned it first? Who burned it second? Who burned it third? Who finished the job? And the answer is, many hands, many fires, many centuries. In 391 CE, Alexandria was a Christian city. It had been Christian for decades. The old temples were closing or converted. The old priests were retiring or dead. The old gods were becoming metaphors. But some temples remained. And the largest, the most prominent, the most symbolically charged, was the Serapeum. The Serapeum was not just a temple. It was a complex, a sanctuary dedicated to Serapis, the composite deity invented by the Ptolemies to unite Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. It housed a massive cult statue, said to be so magnificent that visitors gasped when they first saw it. It housed lecture halls and meeting rooms. And it housed a library, the daughter collection, the annex, the survivor. When the main library in the Brucaean district declined, when funding dried up, when scholars left, when the Ptolemies were replaced by Roman emperors who cared more about grain shipments than scrolls, the Serapeum library endured. It became the last repository of Alexandria's intellectual heritage. In 391, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued an edict. Pagan worship was forbidden. Pagan temples were to be closed. Pagan rituals were to cease. Theophilus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, interpreted this edict as authorization. He gathered a crowd. He marched on the Serapeum. What happened next was not a military assault. It was a riot. A mob. Zealots and monks and ordinary citizens swept up in religious fervor. They breached the doors. They defaced the statues. They toppled the cult image of Serapis, a colossus that had stood for 600 years, that had received sacrifices and prayers and processions, that had symbolized Alexandria's unique fusion of cultures. And they burned the library. Scrolls were thrown from windows. They fluttered down into the courtyard like strange white birds. They were gathered into piles. They were set on fire. We do not know exactly what was lost. Philosophical treatises, medical texts, historical chronicles, poetry. We know that Hypatia, the great female scholar, the mathematician, the astronomer, the philosopher, was still teaching in Alexandria at this time. She had access to texts that no one else had. She had students who came from across the Mediterranean to study with her. Some of those texts were probably in the Serapeum library. Some of them probably burned. Hypatia survived the destruction of the Serapeum. She continued teaching. She continued writing. She continued advising the prefect of Alexandria, a Christian named Orestes. But her survival was temporary. Her death was coming. Hypatia was not a Christian. She was not a pagan in any traditional sense. She was a philosopher, trained in the Neoplatonic tradition, which treated the old myths as allegories and sought truth through reason and contemplation. She was also a woman teaching men. In a city increasingly dominated by a church that taught women should be silent. And she was friends with the wrong people. Orestes, the Roman prefect, was a Christian. But he was also a civil administrator, responsible for maintaining order and collecting taxes. He clashed repeatedly with Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, over the extent of ecclesiastical authority. Hypatia was caught between them. She advised Orestes. Cyril saw her as an obstacle. The months leading up to her death were marked by escalating tension. Monks from the Nitrian desert, zealots who lived in extreme asceticism, descended on the city. There were street fights. There were riots. There were accusations. Hypatia was accused of witchcraft, of sorcery, of using satanic arts to bind Orestes to her will. In March of 415, during the season of Lent, a mob gathered. They intercepted Hypatia's litter as she was being carried through the city. They dragged her out. They took her to the Serapeum, another converted temple, now a church. What they did to her there is described in graphic detail by contemporary sources. They stripped her. They killed her with oyster shells, sharp-edged fragments that could cut flesh. They tore her body apart. They burned the pieces. And then they burned her books, her personal library, her commentaries, her correspondence, her unfinished work. A student gathered what he could: scraps, fragments, notes. He preserved them, copied them, passed them on. But most of what Hypatia knew died with her. She was the last great scholar of Alexandria. Not the last person to study there, or teach there, or write there, but the last one whose reputation extended across the Mediterranean, who attracted students from distant cities, who embodied the ideal of the philosopher-scholar. After her death, Alexandria's intellectual life contracted. It did not disappear. There were still Christians who valued learning, still monks who copied manuscripts, still bishops who collected books. But the center of gravity shifted. To Constantinople, to Rome, to the emerging monasteries of Ireland and Syria and Mesopotamia. Alexandria became a provincial city, important for its harbor, its grain, its strategic position, not for its mind. In 642 CE, Alexandria was conquered by Arab armies. The conquest was relatively peaceful. The city surrendered after a siege of several months. The terms of surrender were generous. The inhabitants could keep their property, practice their religion, and conduct their business. They just had to pay tribute. General Amr ibn al-As, the commander of the Arab forces, was a pragmatic man. He had conquered half of the Byzantine Empire's eastern territories. He had negotiated with generals and bishops and local governors. He understood that ruling a conquered population required more than military force. Someone, the sources disagree on who, told him about the library. Not the original library. That had been in decline for centuries. Not the Serapeum library. That had been destroyed in 391. But there were still books in Alexandria. Private collections, church libraries, university holdings. Thousands of scrolls and codices scattered across the city, gathering dust. Amr wrote to the Caliph Omar in Medina. What should be done with these books? Omar's reply became famous. If the books agree with the Quran, they are redundant. If they disagree, they are heretical. Burn them. The logic was simple, absolute, devastating. Scrolls were carried from their repositories. They were bundled together, loaded onto carts, transported to the city's bathhouses. For 6 months, the furnaces of Alexandria burned with papyrus and parchment. Greek philosophy heated bathwater. Egyptian medicine warmed rooms. Roman law produced steam. A bathhouse attendant stoked the fire. He did not care what he was burning. Fuel was fuel. A scholar protested. He was ignored. A citizen watched. He did nothing. A monk fled into the desert, carrying what he could save. The smoke rose continuously. A thin black column visible from the harbor, from the palace, from the lighthouse. When it was over, the shelves were empty. The libraries were gone. The accumulated knowledge of a millennium reduced to ash. Or so the story goes. Part 7. The Scattering, 1530 to 1730. The story of Omar and the bathhouses is contested. Some historians accept it as essentially true. Others dismiss it as propaganda, invented centuries later to discredit Islam. Still others argue that it is partially true, that some books were burned, but not as many as the legend claims. What is certain is that not everything was destroyed. Before the conquest, before the furnaces, before Omar's letter, scholars had been fleeing Alexandria for generations, taking their books with them, carrying knowledge east and west. Nestorian Christians, persecuted for their theological beliefs, moved to Persia. They brought Greek medical texts and philosophical treatises. They translated them into Syriac. They established schools. When the Abbasid caliphs built Baghdad, they invited these scholars to their new capital. The House of Wisdom became the greatest center of learning since Alexandria itself. Translators worked in teams, Syriac speakers converting Greek texts into Arabic, often via intermediate translations. Euclid and Galen and Aristotle and Hippocrates, all preserved in Arabic when their Greek originals were lost. From Baghdad, knowledge traveled further east, to Persia, to India, to the borders of China, and it traveled west, to Muslim Spain, to Córdoba and Toledo and Granada. In Toledo, in the 12th century, Christian scholars learned Arabic specifically to access these texts. Gerard of Cremona translated 71 works from Arabic to Latin, including Ptolemies' Almagest and Aristotle's Physics and Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. From Toledo, knowledge spread across Europe, to Paris and Oxford and Bologna, to the new universities that were becoming the intellectual centers of the Latin West. Meanwhile, in monasteries scattered across the former Roman Empire, monks copied manuscripts. Not systematically, not comprehensively, but persistently, generation after generation. In St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, in the deserts of Egypt, ancient codices survived. In the Vatican Library, manuscripts accumulated. In the libraries of Constantinople, Greek texts waited, for centuries, for the Italian humanists who would rediscover them. The knowledge of Alexandria did not die. It scattered, like seeds. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. His campaign was a military failure. His fleet was destroyed by Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. His army was trapped. He abandoned his troops and slipped back to France, where he staged a coup and made himself emperor. But Napoleon brought scientists with him. Engineers, cartographers, botanists, antiquarians. They surveyed the ruins. They measured the pyramids. They found the Rosetta Stone. And they looked for the library. They did not find it. They found Pompey's pillar, actually a monument to Diocletian. They found the catacombs. They found scattered fragments of the ancient city. But not the library. 19th century archaeologists did better. They excavated the Bercaean district. They found foundation walls. They found mosaic floors. They found pottery and coins and small objects. They did not find scrolls. Papyrus does not survive in wet soil. The ancient library's collection, if it was ever buried, had long since rotted away. 20th century archaeologists turned to the harbor. Underwater excavations revealed the remains of the Ptolemaic royal quarter. Columns and sphinxes and statues, toppled by earthquakes, submerged for centuries. Marine archaeologists found a marble hand, reaching upward from the seabed. They found bronze coins with Alexander's profile. They found the submerged ruins of the lighthouse. They did not find the library. 21st century technology offered new possibilities. Multispectral imaging could read chart papyrus too damaged for human eyes. CT scanning could reveal texts hidden inside mummy cartonnage. Artificial intelligence could reconstruct damaged inscriptions. Fragment by fragment, word by word, the dead began to speak. A scrap of Sappho, recovered from a mummy casing. A line of Euripides, preserved in a medieval palimpsest. A medical text by Galen, found in a monastery library. Not the Library of Alexandria, not its hundreds of thousands of scrolls, but something. Evidence that the knowledge was real, that the loss was real, that the recovery is possible. In 2002, on the waterfront of modern Alexandria, a new library opened. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina is not a reconstruction. It does not pretend to be the original. It is a different building, in a different location, with a different mission. But it is a library, a place where knowledge is gathered, preserved, and passed from one hand to the next. The building itself is a statement. A massive granite cylinder, tilted slightly, sunk into the ground. The exterior wall is carved with letters from every written language: Greek and Latin and Arabic and Chinese and Hebrew and Devanagari and cuneiform and hieroglyphs. The reading room is terraced, cascading downward toward the Mediterranean. For 1,000 seats. Natural light from above. The sense of being inside a sundial. The collection is growing. Not 500,000 scrolls, not yet. But books and manuscripts and digital records, acquired through donation and purchase and international cooperation. The library has a conservation laboratory, where ancient papyrus fragments are cleaned and stabilized. It has a digital archive, where manuscripts from across the region are scanned and made available online. It has a planetarium, where visitors can see the stars as Eratosthenes saw them. It has a memorial, a wall of black granite, inscribed with the names of cultures that have suffered library destruction. Assyria, Mesopotamia, Mexico, China, Bosnia, and at the center, an eternal flame. It is not a monument to the fire. It is a monument to what survived the fire, and to what we build next. So, who burned the Library of Alexandria? Julius Caesar burned it. Accidentally, perhaps. Regretfully, perhaps. But his torches, his ships, his war. Theophilus burned it. Deliberately, zealously, in the name of God. Cyril burned it. Not with fire, but with fanaticism. Not scrolls, but the mind that read them. Omar burned it. By edict, by theology, by indifference to what he did not understand. Time burned it. Neglect burned it. Indifference burned it. The library was not destroyed in a single catastrophic fire. It was destroyed in a series of fires spread across centuries, each one fueled by a different ideology, each one justified by a different rationale. War burned it. Religion burned it. Politics burned it. Ignorance burned it. And yet, a girl in modern Alexandria stands before the eternal flame. She is 12 years old. She has come with her school on a field trip. She has never heard of Eratosthenes, or Hypatia, or Callimachus. She does not know about Caesar's torches, or Omar's letter, or Theophilus's mob. But she is standing in a library. She is surrounded by books. She is looking at a flame that commemorates everything that was lost. And she is thinking about what she will do next. The Library of Alexandria is not a place. It is an idea. The idea that knowledge matters. That it can be gathered, preserved, shared. That each generation has a responsibility to pass on what it has received. The idea that loss is inevitable, but surrender is not. The library burned. Many times. By many hands. For many reasons. But the scholars who fled Alexandria carried scrolls in their saddlebags. The monks who copied manuscripts worked by candlelight. The translators who rendered Greek into Arabic and Arabic into Latin preserved what their predecessors had saved. They did not rebuild the library. They could not. Some things, once lost, are lost forever. But they built something else. Something that carried the same spirit, the same purpose, the same hope. They built the future. We are their descendants. We live in a world shaped by their labor. Every time we open a book, every time we search a database, every time we teach a child to read, we are continuing their work. The library is not a ruin. It is not a memory. It is not a question. The library is us. What will we build next?